Welcome to another Silmarillion Sessions episode. I'm your co-host, Dr. Cameron McHale Thompson, and this is my co-host, Mr. William Lassiter. Last episode, we were talking about Melkor and the orcs. We started with the Melkor and the elves, but the first part of this conversation, which we covered in the last episode, address the big question, the big, hairy, ugly question of the orcs, since the orcs come from the elves. So you want to learn more about that. That's what we covered there. And now we're getting to the elves, right, and as they begin to move. So the Valar have called them out of the darkness, out of the something like the twilight or the dawn, the dark before the dawn, where they woke up under the stars. But then a nightmare invaded the space. That was Melkor. And we saw how orcs came out of that. And some of the elves refused the call outright. And that was the first division of the elves. We have different kinds of elves now, distinct from those which then were snatched away and transformed into a totally different kind of being, which we call orcs. Now, today, we're going to talk about the elves and how they sort of evolved into different elf clans or tribes and the different lines. Some of the different lines of the elves, some of the divisions are more natural in the way that you might have different nations of people. They migrate into different places and they slowly evolve into, with different customs and habitudes, different cultures. And some of the divisions are more supernatural, more divine oriented. Those that go all the way across to the realm of the gods, those that respond at first but linger in the twilight, and all the different kind of options in between. But the first thing I think that we should address, that we want to talk about, is to answer the question, why so much about elves? Because here on out, it's Elfland. It's elves the whole way through. As reportedly one of Tolkien's own comrades, interlocutors, fellow scholars in the Inklings, club that they're part of. He starts relating something at some point. He said, "Not another elf. Come on." And and I think this bears addressing at this point, because it's not just okay. It's a story about elves. This is in fact the frame narrative for the whole of the Silmarillion, is that it's an elvish work, right? This is elvish myth and legend. Okay, we can go along with that, but it really pushes the question, why so much about elves, when we're going into meticulous detail about the different cultures and tribes and nations and tongues of elves. Why so much detail about that? And so here's a quote from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And I want to propose this to you. And Will, I know you've got some comments about this. Here's what Tolkien says in the midst of talking about fairies. And fairy, remember, that's a place, not a kind of creature. But fairy meaning that world of fantasy, this other spiritual kind of realm. Elves would be included in this, living in that liminal space between there and our ordinary experience. He says, "For it is man who is, in contrast to fairies," and we should hear elves here as well, "it is man who is, in contrast to fairies, supernatural, and often of diminutive stature." That is to say, man is the more supernatural thing, and the fairies or elves are actually the more natural. Man is perhaps even more diminutive, smaller, shorter, Lilliputian than elves, contrary to the image we might have from Tinkerbell, which he hated with a deep loathing. Okay. So, whereas the elves or fairies are natural, they are far more natural than man. Such is their doom, their fate. The road to fairyland is not the road to heaven, nor even to hell, I believe, though some have held that it may lead there indirectly by the devil's tithe. So what is Tolkien saying there? How is it? I mean, frame it just bluntly, how in the heck is man, how are we supposed to understand this idea that human beings are more supernatural to elves and elves are somehow the more natural thing?
Yeah. Yeah, and why would we as men give a rip about elves, right? Because they're
Right.
not they're a different thing. It's like us being concerned about foxes or something.
Hmm.
Well, if we're going to have an insight into it at all, I think part of it is that we go back to two things we brought up before. One is his letter to letter to Milton Waldman, it's letter 131, where he talks about how his whole work seems to be concerned with three primary ideas: the idea of the fall, mortality, and the machine. And the reason I think that's important to go back to is because uh, elves are in some ways the first to deal with the fall and the first to deal with mortality. And so therefore their response to it gives us an example of how we could respond to the same problem, so to speak. I think that he was dealing with the idea of how does a mortal being deal with this inevitability of the fall, the fact that things are messed up, the fact that we're going to die, and how do we respond? Do we respond with a machine-like process oriented imagination, what he terms later on as magic, or do we respond in some other way? So that's important. But I think the other thing that's important is elsewhere in this on fairy stories, he talks about how the real term he wants to use is not is fantasy. He talks about fantasy and how fantasy is the realm of thought that's created through enchantment and all that that involves versus the realm of magic. So for him, it's like two things that are almost set apart from each other. Magic is more akin to the machine for Tolkien, as far as I gather, than enchantment.
Right.
Magic is that attempt to manipulate and control and dominate as through Kabbalistic means, just as the machine is that attempt to dominate through the mechanized world. And he seems to say that's a bad response to grasp at control. It's a bad response to fallen mortality. And the right response is this realm of enchantment, which is a creation of the vision of hope and joy in other people. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I think he's concentrating on whatever those beings who first responded, they were beings of enchantment and beings, as you mentioned, of fairy. So their primary uh, their primary skill was with creating things of beauty and joy. And so I think he's contemplating what does that look like? What does it look like to have a race or have a faculty, if you will, for us that whose primary thing is not to grasp, not to dominate, but rather to create enchantment. So I think that's a large
Hmm.
portion of it. I think to some degree that also explains why, as humans, we find ourselves frequently drawn to these figures of Elfland because you know, characters like Legolas, they're attractive characters. It would be nice to be able to slide down the trunk of an Oliphant, and shoot orcs all the way down, these kind of mental faculties and have this longevity and all this. And so they are, I guess you could say, somewhat akin to our current superhero fascination. The elves are. But it's a fascination. It's a fascination in us with what would it be like if we weren't so diminished by the fall and mortality? What would it be like? And what would it be like if we were able to create things that developed into beauty rather than just being the mechanized Darth Vader, controlling the you and I together will rule the universe, father and son. I think that's what he's getting at. And I think that's why he is, some people say, obsessed with with elves, just a stab.
Hmm. And I think that's exactly right. I think there's an interesting aspect to that you touched on it. That I keep thinking about that line that where he says specifically, like, the road to fairy, the road to Elfland, is not the road to heaven or the road to
Hmm.
hell. It's simply another dimension of this created world, even material
Hmm.
universe, because the elves and fairies are material, if perhaps a rarer material, expensive, rarefied air, a rarefied sort of materiality to them than the human body. Now,
Hmm.
what's interesting is, you in some of these ancient traditions, it's like just what you said, yeah, that man has fallen below has fallen below his natural state. So the human being, we tend to assume, even, and I think this is a common paradigm that I see among Christians approaching Tolkien's work, is that they might say, okay, well, human beings are human beings, right? They're just like us, and the idea is, the fundamental assumption about human beings is we evolved from apes or some lower level realm of existence, and we're on our way up and higher. It's a downward to upward because we're so shaped by the progressivist myth of modernity, right? Things are always going every day in every way. We're getting better and better, right? And whether or not we openly repudiate sort of Darwinism, most people, even great opponents of evolution and Darwinism, tend to implicitly actually still hold to those principles. I've found in my experience, and because it's just the dominant paradigm around us, that we live in that air, we breathe that air, um, and um, and that elves must therefore be like the angels. We read the Lord of the Rings. We say, well, the elves are basically angels. They're kind of in between men and God, or the gods, if we want to talk about the Val. Those who are the more cognoscenti among us, who are like, okay, well, there are the Valar. They're mentioned occasionally in Lord of the Rings, but you've read the Silmarillion, and so it's, you see, they're somehow mediated in the hierarchy between men and the gods, and there's a way in which that's not wrong, right? Insofar as the elves are immortal, they can dwell in Valinor. Men don't really get to do that. We'll find out that that's not true of all elves, and there's a historical reason for that. But the idea of elves are kind of an analogy or an allegory for angels, sort of, maybe a little less than that. But I think we tend to approach being this quasi-angelic beings, especially when you look at Galadriel and the way that she's depicted, the way that she's talked about in the lore. It's very tempting to see elves, even in our own, and this isn't just modern interpretations of Tolkien's own works. Even in our own fairy tales, we can see elves often mistaken for fairies, or excuse me, elves, fairies mistaken for angels, or vice versa. And there's a lot of very interesting folkloric interconnectedness there. But I think what Tolkien's proposing is a harkening back to an older, so pre-modern understanding of man. And this is definitely the case in the ancient Near East, and even early Christian period in the Near East, is that man started out, like human beings started out at a much more divinized, a much more divine, even higher natural state. We had greater natural capacities. And this is something I've alluded to in the past, that Adam and Eve could see farther, maybe even see into the future or the past in different ways. Stories about the early lives of the saints who become sort of really more participating in the divine nature have these heightened capacities, or light, they become luminous, light shines through them and from them. And the common wisdom of these ancient societies is that, well, those people aren't superhuman. They're closer to being human. They're closer to being our natural state. In fact, in the stories of the life of St. Anthony of the Desert, they refer to him as finally attaining the natural state of man, finally made it back up the ladder to where we started. And so there's this idea that man has fallen into a greater density, a greater materiality, and has less of his natural capacities than we used to. But, and this is what Tolkien's saying, man is more supernatural because in his full nature, he's actually closer to the divine than the elves are. They just appear more divine to us from this vantage point because we've fallen down to the level of the animals, where the elves are purely natural and they don't get any higher. And sort of to break the image, sort of the naive image of elves as being kind of like angels, we have the whole of the Silmarillion where elves do bad stuff all the time.
Oh yeah.
In fact, they live out, and this is what's interesting. I think, as a literary perspective, the elves in the Silmarillion live out all the bad, naughty stuff that we know in humanity, and in a way that we don't see in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. The elves that we meet in The Lord of the Rings, the elves we meet in The Hobbit, are pretty much, as far as we could tell, essentially perfect in some way or another.
Yeah.
Right? They don't seem to have flaws. Maybe Celeborn's a little racist, a little prejudiced against dwarves. He's got a lot of good reasons for that, as we'll see, though. Very brutal things happened that he was witness to, on the part of dwarves doing bad things, and so he's got reason to believe that. Um, but yeah, so literarily, why, if you're going to have a story that ultimately, it's an elvish story, but it ends with men, right? Men become incorporated, and we really end with
Yes.
that. Numenor
Yes.
plays a role. We move out of the Silmarillion proper and end up with the Akallabeth. And then obviously the Lord of the Rings is purely a mannish work, right? It has to do with
Right.
humans.
Right.
Why bother having this whole other story of elves, I guess literarily as the stand-in, as the symbol for human beings, human faults and flaws,
Mhm.
extrapolated into immortal. Like, what would humans do if they were immortal, and then the bad things and the ramifications of that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. First off, there was a point in there we were talking about mankind being superior in a way to many things. It reminded me of Psalm 8, where it says in Psalm 8, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visited him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned him with glory and honor, and you made him to have dominion over the works of your hands." That's getting at that whole idea, right?
I hate to do a little actually about that. It really says you've made him a little lower than the gods,
Ah, yeah.
but in
Oh, yep. The footnote.
Western context that's allergic to the existence of other beings, well, he must mean angels. The author meant angels,
Mm,
Yeah, he said
mm,
gods, meant gods, because God created
mm,
the gods, right? I mean, that's the old paradigm prior
mm.
to sort of Protestant revolutionizing of Western thought. But yeah,
I think
so
that's a,
made him little less than the gods.
yeah. I think the footnote that I have here is because I just grabbed the first translation, which is the New King James version. But
Hmm.
it says that in Hebrew it's Elohim. You made him
Right.
little less than Elohim, which is the whole cabinet
Plural of the
of
gods, the
yeah,
divine
right.
council.
But I think that there's a lot lost in our modern world. I know we touched on this before. There's a lot lost in our modern world. We made this sort of streamlining of the whole divine thing to be like God, devil, and then some stuff in between. But
Right.
there was never like this like complexity that I think existed both in medieval world but also in the ancient world. Like the ancient world talks about the Anunnaki all the time. Who are these Anunnaki in our current state of mania? The Anunnaki are some sort of like aliens that have walking around the earth, coming to shopping malls and stuff like this. But in the traditional thing, when they talk about the Anunnaki, these would be the gods that walked around on the earth. They were a whole pantheon of different gods, and they came originally from I think Babylonian, Sumerian and Babylonian culture. But there's a carryover into Jewish culture where they talked about the Anunnaki who came down and mated with humans and created these powerful heroes of old, and that's in the Genesis story. So we get like a little glimpse or an insight into what this world before the Jewish faith came into existence, what it was like with this multiplicity of deities, this multiplicity of powers on the earth, or as the Egyptians called them, the Neteru, the netters, that they had
Hmm.
no problem with this connection to a world where there's lots of different deities and there's lots of different powers. Even if there was one major power, there was lots of little powers within the court of the powers, and maybe some interim between those powers and the mortal realm that we have too. And whatever that interim was in the Anglo-Saxon or the Norse realm, they talked about that interim being filled with beings that were fairy, that were elvish, that were
Hmm.
not just the elves, but the sprites and pixies and all those other characters of the woods. So, yeah, for us, is that we say, forget that. That's just God. There's devils, maybe some angels, and that's it. And it's kind of yeah. I mean, it's tough even to talk about the idea that angels aren't really angels. Angel is a Greek word meaning messenger. So the seraphim and the
Right.
cherubim, seraphim and cherubim are sort of angels, but not really. They're They are more like the keepers of the wisdom, or the people that the beings that surround the throne. Angel in itself is just the messenger. It's the lowest rung. Angels and archangels, the lowest rung of those beings that connect to the mortal realm and bring messages to the mortal realm. So, and I know we've
Hmm.
hashed this out to some degree before, but when Tolkien is delving into this world of elves, I think he's delving into a world that goes way back in history and is somewhat hard for us to conceive of immediately because we want to fit it into the slots that we already have. Like you said, elves equal angels. No, they don't. They equal a race of beings that are powerful and are creating of enchantment, but they're not human. They're not mortal as men are
Right.
mortal. They are why the firstborn. I don't know. It's hard to say what else that would be necessarily. Now, I hate to
Right.
keep soapboxing, but I'm going to keep soapboxing and say there is one thing which I think is good to dwell on. Tolkien has made the connection in enchantment to a faculty that human beings have, as he has
Hmm.
made the connection of the machine and magic to faculties that human beings currently possess. Magic is not, like we said, Expelliarmus, wave a wand and make lightning come out and, change a chair into a hamburger. That's not what we're talking about. Magic is a form of being able to use knowledge and language and imagery in order to dominate and control, Tolkien seems to
Hmm.
suggest. And enchantment is a way of using knowledge and imagery in order to create beauty and secondary worlds and thought and encouragement. And so you could say to some degree that elves represent, if we're going to do any allegory, which I know is tough realm for Tolkien, if you're going to do any allegory, elves represent the human faculty of being able to use imagery and words in this way, and the dangers that that might entail. Because he does say here, if I remember right, he does say that this elvish thing is not the road to heaven. In other words, it's not whatever the faculty is in humans that does this creative business is not the road to heaven. You don't get to heaven by creating great art. But he says it's not even the road to hell. Okay, the elvish faculty in us is not the road to damn ourselves. But he does say then some have held that it may lead to hell indirectly by the devil's tithe. It's all focus. There's always an element of focus. Like, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, old man. What do you mean the devil's tithe? What are you talking about? If I were to speculate on that line right there, I think he'd be suggesting that whatever this faculty is, whatever this thing is that we do, this elvish thing that we do, it
Hmm.
has been claimed by some that it leads to a damnation because you end up falling in love with your own creations. You end up thinking that this is the only thing that's important. And family and caring for the poor and being kind to others, those are to take a back seat to the fact that you are a great sculptor or the fact that you're a great painter or you're a great musician. So like who's the famous composer? Uh, I knew I'd blank on his name, but great polyphonic composer, wonderful lamentations for Holy Week that he composed. He was a duke, and he was
Gregorio
like,
Allegri.
oh, no, 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 because the
Who's the
Allegri
other
didn't do
guy?
what I'm about to talk about. This guy
Okay.
was wonderful as a composer, but he caught his wife a flagrante delicto, and so he murdered her and her husband, and then had their bodies stuffed and mounted in his hall. And that was not nice. These are not good
That.
things. So you get your art, which is great, but you murdered and stuffed your wife, and that's kind of not the road to heaven, right there. Um,
Yeah.
his name will come to me when I least need it. But I mean, there are numerous cases like that, of artists and the artistic thing where you're a brilliant artist, but something's terribly wrong with your road to heaven, road to hell thing going on. And maybe that's what he's getting at. Maybe that's what he's getting at. Maybe what he's showing in these stories is that this elvish thing is not completely untainted from
Mhm.
failure and from damning itself, but it damns itself and it fails in a way that's different from the realm of the machine and magic and the way humans, so to speak, the human faculty, I guess, does it. So anyway, I'm gonna put the microphone down for a minute and try to remember that guy's name.
All right. Devil's Tithe, I think, I'm assuming that Tolkien is referring here to what we see in some fairy stories from the British Isles of fairies having to, because of complex I don't know what to say, interworld politics, let's just say, that for one reason or another, in certain fairy tales, the fairies are under some sort of feudal relationship with hell. And so every so many years, every 7 years, right, a magical number, the fairies have to owe some sort of tribute to the devil. And this takes the form in these fairy stories. Often, this is like the initiator of the plot. They kidnap a baby or child or something. That's how some of these are probably something you see among the elf type peoples of Scandinavian mythology, but you do see in some of the stories like Tam Lin, that kind of thing, where the Tam Lin was, though he was a mortal man, had been imprisoned by the Queen of the Fairies when she caught him, and the fairies have to give one of their, excuse me, the fairies sometimes give one of their own people as a tithe to hell every 7 years, and so then that's what they try and build their
Okay.
numbers by kidnapping a human being, and so it's maybe a little less sinister, but I think I've seen it in both ways,
Yeah.
where you have the fairies either directly have to I mean, the fairies in some way are under the control of the devil, which is consistent with the idea that they represent something of the natural realm. And if since the world is fallen, there's a spiritual dimension, or at least a more sentient dimension, of which the elves are the more material of the creatures, of the intelligences that inhabit that realm. Other things like tree spirits or the spirit of a waterfall or something might be less material elements of that, personalities of that kind of that in some way things in the physical world, in the material world, are somehow under the control of, under the dominion of, not manipulated control, but under the sort of tyrannical dominion of the demons, of Satan, of hell in some way, which is why a lot of miracles in Christian legends and stories, saints come in and they do something, and they drive out the evil spirit from this or that place. So something that was a pagan sacred well is maybe restored to its proper functioning as a divine holy well, no longer under the control of fairies who are subject to Satan, but now under the control of fairies who are no longer subject to Satan.
Got it.
Like that's, so like in Ireland is what we're most familiar with, because there's a lot of folklore and legend that we're more cognizant of in popular society. Most of us, it's pretty widely diffused. But you have, like, so that's why these holy wells, they're not just like, okay, well, Christians came in as though they were outside people and took pagan stuff and then just flipped it and made it Christian. But the whole mentality is that the people who are pagans know that there's something witchy about this particular well or spring of water or tree or mountain or whatever it is. And then some guy he becomes possessed by the Holy Spirit. He becomes divinized. The power of Christ is with him. He's a powerful being. He's a human, but somehow augmented by divine favor. He comes in and he casts out the demon, or he touches it, or something happens, and the bad fairies and or the devils leave that place, but the nature of the place doesn't change, as somehow being a more elevated, more powerful kind of place. And so even the fairies become loosed, just like a blind man or the leper or a paralytic are healed, or animals and human beings are brought back from the dead, or the demons are driven out of the waters. Likewise, fairies, elves, who are personalities of some of these spiritual elements of what we tend to think of as material creation can be then unbound from the
Yeah.
fetters, loosed from the fetters of evil. But they still have free agency in them in and of themselves. And I think that's an interesting thing. That's why they're not quite like angels or devils in themselves, is that they have free agency like men and women, but different, I mean, in their own way, but like human beings, they have free agency and they might be still tricksy, even if they're not outright evil. You know,
Hmm.
the same way your neighbor might not be evil, but he might pull pranks on you or you know, whatever. Perhaps a little more
Hmm.
mischievous because they're of a different nature entirely than human beings, even if we're similar in certain ways.
Hmm. 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 So, okay, so in terms of the natural supernatural thing, which you just brought up a minute ago, it's almost like it's in their nature to continue doing this, whatever this thing is, and they don't have the choice to be able to go against that nature, even when they're redeemed. Does that
Mm-hmm.
sort of sound right?
I think to a certain extent, but like think of like a cat, right? Because we can all appreciate the fey nature of cats, felines.
Hmm.
They're different from dogs, right? Cats are witchy. Some's not, you know, one explanation is they ain't right in the head. Another explanation is they dwell somewhere between here and fairy, right? They're on a different plane or they live across planes, which is why cats are commonly associated with these kinds of things, strange phenomena. If you've ever had a
Right.
cat in your house at night, cats are associated with strange phenomena. They're bizarre. So let's take a cat. It's neither evil nor good. It's just a cat. It doesn't have, in the case of a cat, it doesn't have moral agency. It can't reflect on its actions. It can plot against you, but it can't reflect on its own actions. Um, Nonetheless, it's not reliable. It can come up to you and say, pet me, pet me, pet me, and all of a sudden you're
Yeah.
caressing it, and out of nowhere, it just gets a demon spirit and it bites and scratches you and then runs off. Right? It's not, in the case of the cat, it doesn't have a free will. Like that's its nature, and its nature is chaotic neutral. Right? It's essentially chaotic neutral or chaotic evil. Maybe chaotic. It's chaotic in any case, right? I think the idea is that elves and fairies have free moral agency, but they're always going to exercise that as the kind of thing that they are.
Yeah, that's something I've always wondered about with the difference in Tolkien's world between elves and men. It is almost as though elves elves have, as you said, free agency, but they're always going to choose as elves in
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is. Whereas human beings can choose at any moment to do the right thing or the wrong thing.
Right.
Unless I'm much mistaken. And it kind of reflects something of what I've been taught about with angels. You know, the angelic powers have free agency, but because their intellect is so powerful, it reinforces their agency so that once chosen, never different. Like they
Right.
choose something, and that's why the fallen angels, because they chose once, and dang, everything is reinforced by their intellectual agency to be able to say, "Oh, you did the right thing. Just continue doing this." Um, and I wonder when he makes that distinction between natural and supernatural, is that where he's going with this? That elves are natural in the sense that they don't, like angels, they don't have the ability to change on a regular basis. Whereas humans, it's almost like every day you have to make that decision again and again and
Yeah.
again.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that so elves are embodied, just like humans are embodied. So unlike an angel, angelic being, a spiritual disembodied intelligence of some sort, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities, all that. They don't exist. So a non-embodied creature like an angel doesn't exist in time.
Mm.
Period. Elves exist in time. They're embodied, but it's not the same kind of time. And
Mhm.
also, they're naturally immortal. They can be killed, I suppose, but even when they're killed in Tolkien's Legendarium, they end up back in after some period of time in the halls of the dead, the halls of Mandos. They end up with the possibility of being somehow back, not reincarnated, but somehow back, even though part of them dwells in Elfland beyond. And so this is a case of somebody like Glorfindel, who defeated a Balrog, was killed in the process, and yet shows up in Rivendell to help spook off Nazis. So spook off
Right, the Nazgul, yeah.
Nazgul,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But elves live in time, so they still, I think if we're going to follow along with sort of like a medieval scholastic reasoning about it, they have bodies, so they still have free agency because they exist in time. But if you think about it, the older the elf gets, the wiser it gets.
Right.
And so just like a human being, you tend to solidify your character in very natural ways and choose the same kinds of actions as you've chosen heretofore. Well, if you're 5,000 years old and not just 80 years old, but if you're 5,000 years old, you got a whole lot of consistent habits, you might say. So I don't think they're so constrained in terms of like a metaphysical way, but their perception of what matters and doesn't matter, what motivates them and doesn't motivate them, is very different from human beings whose span of life is. And maybe that's why. Maybe that's precisely why. And this is extrapolating, and it's not really fair. I think Tolkien would disagree with me. But there's a way in which we could understand, why do we see them doing all this different kind of behavior? Why do we see all these different kinds of moral choices in the Silmarillion? Effectively, but in Lord of the Rings, comparatively no immoral behavior on the part of elves.
Well, yeah,
one could say they're younger. They're just that many thousands of years less experienced. These are, the Silmarillion is all taking place when elves as a race are in their teenage years.
Yeah.
And then it's later on, you've got like Galadriel has been there, man. Like she's got her hands dirty even. Back in the day, things were pretty crazy. But now she and Celeborn, they've been around for a long, long time. And they're old as far as Elrond's concerned. And he's been around in ways that are absolutely flabbergasting to Bilbo.
Yeah. That's a really significant point, I think. One that I think bears a little bit of reflection on, that I've always marveled at how long it takes for us humans to learn anything. I'm 54 and I'm just now coming to certain realizations that I probably should have come to when I was in my teens, but because I was in my teens, I didn't come to them, and I'm reflecting back on people that I knew in their teens or people I know in their 20s, and thinking, why don't you know certain things yet? Well, it's because our time frame, it takes a long time for us to learn stuff, and we don't have the longevity to be able to make that mistake and reflect on it for 1,000 years. And elves do. So when you're meeting any of these elves in Lord of the Rings, as you mentioned, they've been through a great deal, and they've had this long period of time to learn to not be fooled by Morgoth ever again. As I think in somewhere it says, the elves realized who this guy was, and they were not going to be fooled again. And that's why they don't fall for the gimmicks of Melkor or of his subordinate Sauron. Whereas human beings like Denethor, as we'll see, falls right into his clutches because he thinks he's doing right, but he doesn't have the experience to say this is a trap. This whole gazing into the iPhone. I mean, Palantir. And I wonder about that whole business too. Is the reflection a reflection on wouldn't it be nice if we had this power? Or is the reflection on we do have this power, but we only recognize that we have this in retrospect. Like once we've gotten to a certain age, we reflect back on our previous selves and see how we have been developing over time. Maybe there's no answer to that. It's just interesting to me the way he set this up.
I think that is very interesting because when we look at the characters in the Lord of the Rings, so now, because the question is about man, let's take a look at the human work. In the characters in the Lord of the Rings, you see, and we'll see this a little bit in the Akalabeth, in the Fall of Numenor as well. You see somebody like Aragorn, right? He's always described as this more somber, solemn, wise, rough and tumble character. Sure, so he's clearly a human being, but he's significant. He's significantly derived. I mean, he's one of the kings. He's the heir of the kings of Numenor, which is to say, he's got elvish blood, and in fact, divine blood. Because we'll talk about Melian and Thingol at the end of this episode here in just a few minutes to wrap up. But you see somebody like him, and I think then as a literary figure, he carries this. He represents in many ways, as does Elrond. Elrond's brother is his great ancestor. This crossing over, this transferring of some of those characteristics and qualities into humanity. And that's what the Numenorians throughout the Lord of the Rings. This is mentioned, the quality of Numenorian folk, the kings of men. These are terms that are repeated again and again, and that is to say those that are more elf-like. And Faramir is even described as being a little bit more like that.
Yeah.
Less
Yeah.
otherworldly, but has these characteristics because, not because it's, and what that shows us then, I think, is if we were to interpret then Tolkien's view on this idea to the question that you raised, I think it would be fair to say we have these capacities. We have the same kind of characteristics in nature, if only we could live up to that nature, live up to that potential. And that's maybe one of the things that distinguishes or that differentiates, for example, Faramir from his brother. Whenever we've got a set of brothers, especially when one dies, either at the hand of the other brother or independently, as the case of Boromir, Faramir, we've got to look at the comparison of what's going on there. And you've got Faramir and Boromir. Boromir, very much human being, going for the glory, going for the bold, practical sense, want to go and do this thing. Very short-sighted, like long-sighted from a human perspective, very short-sighted if you've got a lifespan of thousands and thousands of years. Whereas Faramir is a little bit more melancholic, a little more reflective, a little more keen-sighted. They both have the dream. Faramir had the dream first, the prophecy that had them go look for Imladris to, find Rivendell, which is to say find Elvenhome, right? To find Elfland, cross into Elfland in some way. They both have the dream. Faramir should have gone, but he didn't. He had it first. Boromir goes, Faramir survives, and when we're introduced to Faramir, we're shown how much more elvish he and his people are, in contrast to his brother of the same mother and father, is of a very different sort. And I think we're being shown there two aspects of humanity, not our nature as it is, but our nature determined by our awareness and our choices. We tend to live more like Boromir or like Denethor in the worst case scenario, but we have the capacity to live like Faramir or like Aragorn if only we somehow awaken to that. And I think wakening versus sleeping is maybe the key concept there. And if I can link that back to sort of, I think there's a lot more we could expand on in this, but it occurs to me that that notion of waking and sleeping actually brings us directly to Thingol and Melian, and this crossing over, this mingling then of the elves with the divine. So not all elves are by nature divine, but one of the elves, one of the chiefs, princes of the one of the elvish tribes, Thingol, and I think it'd be great to delve more into this narrative, this particular story within this chapter in the next episode. He is leading the elves towards the call of the Valar. They've called them, these are the elves that are following the call to the light, but they linger. I think I remember exactly. I think they actually turn aside before they even get to the shores, because then there are those who linger on the shores. These guys turn aside a little bit before they cross the mountains to go to the sea. And Thingol, and ultimately most of his tribe moves on. Thingol is wandering through the woods in a way that beautifully parallels something later that we see between a man and an elf maiden, Beren and Luthien. You have this elf man, Thingol, who actually ends up being Luthien's mother or father, right? I mean, so it's which is why you think he should have a little more sympathy for Beren. But anyway, he wanders into the woods and he sees this goddess, right? Melian is one of the Maya. So she is more or less the same level of thing like Gandalf, but not incarnated like Gandalf. She's like a spirit of the forest or a spirit of a region of land or something like that. But a god type creature, right? A lower level goddess type being, if we want to stick with our, conventional categories that we're familiar with. And he sees her and falls in love with her. And the two of them, they lock into an embrace, and time literally freezes around them in sort of this Sleeping Beauty kind of thing, where they're frozen in time and he's lost from his tribe. Most of his tribe moves on. Some people stick around to look for him and find him until finally the enchantment, as it were, is unlocked, and he and Melian are wedded. and he enters back into ordinary time, and the two of them mingle and create this new, not a new race, but a certain line within this particular race of elves. And that is, their daughter is Luthien, then Luthien
Hmm.
Tenuvio, who marries Baron, the human being. When he sees her, and she's half elf, half goddess, divine. And so you've got this coming together, and the idea of where the linkage from sleep comes in is that the two of them are locked together in a timeless time where they're sort of asleep to the rest of the world. Like I said, a similar way to sleeping. It seems to me very much a Sleeping Beauty kind of,
Oh yeah.
not the fairy tale on the whole, but that element to it. And I think
Hmm.
that's a
Hmm.
very interesting thing.
It is. I gotta admit, it took me a long time to get some of this stuff straight. I think this is where a lot of people, when they read the Silmarillion, they get bogged down right at this point.
Mhm.
It's so many names and so many different things to have to keep in mind that they get bogged down in it. And they say, okay, I'm done.
Mhm.
And so to back up for just a minute, when we're talking about the elves, we're talking about them as all of the elves taken together are those who speak. They speak with voices, which in Elvish is
Right.
Quendi. And so we frequently hear them referred to as the Quendi or the Calaquendi. Then
Mhm.
the Valar, who are afraid for them and the attacks on them by Melkor, decide to call the Quendi towards the Undying Lands to keep them safe, at least until they could deal with Melkor. So far, so good. They
Mhm.
call those people then, and they're the whole migration of elves is en masse leaving Middle Earth, and they're led, if I remember right, by three brothers. So there's a
Yes.
division of three of the Quendi, and they are Elwë and Finwë and Olwë. Elwë, Finwë, and Olwë are the three brothers, which make up the three original divisions of elves, lineages of elves. Of those three brothers, Elwë is the one we're talking about here, who his people linger by the shore, I think, or near the forest. I forget where it is
Mhm.
exactly, but he lingers there, and that's where he finds Melian, the Maya, as you're
Right.
pointing out. And he when he emerges from that sleep, he there's a realm there that he sets up, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Um,
And that
and
becomes
that
the
whole
Doriath, his kingdom.
Doriath, right, the kingdom of Doriath, and he takes on the moniker of what's the full thing that he's called? He's called Elo Thingol, which is King Gray Mantle, Gray Cloak. So Thingol is actually like his title as King of Doriath, but his original name is Elwë, and he was one of the three brothers that were called by
Mhm.
the Valar to go across to the Undying Lands.
Mhm.
Did I get all that right for the sake
Right.
of accuracy?
Yes. So the three go over, they actually see the light, then they come back because they go as emissaries. Let's go check it out first. They
Ah,
come back and then try and bring everybody with them. And so that's an interesting point, because that's true. And I had forgotten that Elwë Singolo, which evolves to be Thingol, is he has seen the light, but the rest of the Teleri have not.
mm,
The prince has beheld the divine light. He's come back and called them, but then they linger precisely because he gets caught up with this enchantment, but it's not an evil thing,
mhm.
right? He stays, and
No.
they, out of loyalty, most of them, some of them I think split and go with, but most of them stay with him, or to look for him and then remain until he awakens again, essentially. And then they
Yeah.
form that's that kingdom of Doriath with Thingol and Melian at the head. And I think
Hmm. Hmm.
that's this is key. And there's a beautiful, and I don't know, Will, if you can share in the final editing of this, share some of these images, as well as a link to them. That one timeline of the elves that you have, I think is a really, really helpful map to show who these different peoples of the elves are and where they stem from. It's a nice sort of genealogical timeline of the elves, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that shows how they evolve and emerge, because that's going to be pivotal going forward as we have the interactions between different kinds of elves
Hmm.
increasingly um, distinct from each other. if not
Hmm.
estranged, increasingly distinct in any case.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is just as a side note, that there's a lot of things that the visual interpretation of Tolkien's world gets right in things like Peter Jackson's works, and there's a lot that gets wrong. And when we come to characters that are very beloved, like Legolas, for instance, he's way down, if you will, on the food chain because many generations later. But is it appropriate that Legolas, for instance, wears all white? Or should he be in all green? Or is he a gray elf? It, these are the things that drive the hardcore fans bananas. But why is it important? I think it's important because his development of these characters is so complex and so I don't know, it's so rich that
Mhm.
to screw it up, just casually screw it up because you aren't attentive to detail, it shows a certain lack of attention. So it is important to note, just at the very basis, we have these three brothers who go off as emissaries, and they come back and they try to get their people to go, and the different groups of elves respond, if you will, differently. They have reactions differently to the call, and events happen to them differently that determine the nature or character of the group. And to
Mhm.
conclude here with Thingol, one of the things that really distinguishes his group of elves is, on the one hand, he is joined with this goddess, and his descendants are god elf types, not just elf enhanced by the Valar, but god elf in their blood itself. The very blood of Luthien is of a goddess in her. And that's quite striking when she then goes and falls in love with Beren later on, and her descendants.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even if looking at this map too, her descendants include this god elf combination. They include, on the one hand, Elrond, his
Hmm.
brother Elros, right? And by a long extension, Aragorn. So
Exactly.
Elrond and Aragorn have a connection through this Elwë, Thingol, and Melian unity. But so too does Arwen Evenstar, who eventually is the queen for Aragorn. So
Exactly.
there's a there's a connection between these characters that people see as just the adventurers that slide down the trunks of Oliphants. Um, and it's a familial connection, but it's also a connection to that divine power. And sorry, one last thing. Your thought about the sleeping thing, I think, is very, very well taken. That there is this divine sleep that is put upon Elwë and Melian in much the same way that Adam is put into his sleep and Eve is taken from his rib. It's a similar image, in
Yeah.
addition to the Sleeping Beauty image as well. Yeah. Um, the divine sleep is a period of stasis where you are just in kairotic time rather than chronological time. Time flows by you during that period, and you fall in love, or
Mhm.
you have a spouse taken from your ribs, or your castle is overgrown with roses or whatever it is, and then you come out of the other end, and then life goes on after that. So anyway,
Right. And I
kind of
think
neat.
that that itself ties right back into what we talked in the last episode. So if you haven't seen it, go watch it. But seeing through time and that
Mm.
device of the divine stasis, suspension out of ordinary time and then reinsertion, and often the wisdom as well as the apparent folly of the person who has made that kind of journey.
Yes.
It's a fascinating, fascinating thing.
I hate to open a can of worms even at the last minute, but I'm
Let
going to open a
everybody
can of
fish in
worms.
with it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just let it linger. I had a good conversation the other day with my daughter about whether or not the really real is the world of depression and politics and the mechanized universe and everything going to hell in a handbasket. Is that the real world? Or is the real world the world of beauty and honor and nobility and love and this kairotic transcendence of the physical world, which is the really real world? And it was a very fruitful conversation because, of course, we could say, on the one hand, oh, yeah, definitely it's the world of beauty and love and honor. I cling to that. But there are a significant amount of people that also say, oh, get real, live in the world of science, live in the world that's actually happening around you, the physical world of depression and politics and, disease and death and that kind of thing. And it
Mhm.
was fascinating to me. Like, if we talked about Tolkien being a writer of joy, for him, the real world is this world of Elwë and Melian, of
Right.
Thingol and Melian. It's the real world is that world of beauty and transcendence and rapture, or what's the word? Uh, ecstasy, standing outside the body.
Right.
You know,
Ecstasies.
that's the real world, and we get glimpses. But the world we have to come back to eventually is the world of Doriath that we rule over, which is the world of dealing with Morgoth and dealing with the physical. And how you view the world, one way or the other, is crucial to how then you operate, how then you deal with everything around you.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's exactly
that's
right.
what I rest my case, Senator.
Very good. And we'll end it with that.
Sounds good to me. So, all right, Miss Dr. Thompson, thank you very much. Farewell wherever you fare. To the Aries receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.
That was a great session. No, no, it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's all right.
All right.